Hi, and welcome to another Reflections program. And surprise, I'm your host, Walt Kosmowski. And those of you who are expecting Fred Hammond, well, Fred Hammond is sitting next to me here. We are at the Cabot location of the Beverly Historical Society on Cabot Street. And we're going to turn the tables a little bit today. And whereas Fred normally interviews folks about Beverly history and so on, I am going to interview Fred today to learn a little bit more about our host, Fred Hammond. And Fred,
thank you, Walter.
You're welcome, Fred. And Fred, to begin with, why don't you tell us a little bit about your early history here? You were born in Beverly. Tell us a little bit about your early life here in Beverly.
Yeah, I was born in 1935, actually in Boston, but was raised in Beverly until the age of 23. Originally on the corner of Whitney and Odell Avenue, and then my parents, sounds like recent history, Walter, bought a house on Bertram Street because of the Depression, which had been foreclosed on from a bank, and they moved there when I was about 2 years old. So my upbringing really is on Bertram Street, which was in Montserrat, the bottom of Prospect Hill, and which was a very, very good place to grow up in the city. And
do you have any recollections of some of your early childhood days on Bertram Street?
Well, there were two fellas in particular who influenced me growing up. One was longtime Beverly residents. One was Geordie Baker, who lives out on Millbrook Road in Centerville. And another's Don Campbell, who lived for many years on East Street next to Herd Stadium in Cooney Field, but now lives in Hamilton. They were older than I was, and there was a nice group of fellas in the neighborhood, and people got along well, and they were fellas I looked up to and encouraged me and things like that. Geordie was one of two Jewish families in the neighborhood. And I can remember one day around Christmas time, him very nicely explaining to me why Jews don't celebrate Christmas. And it was done in such a nice way. I picked up a paper route from Geordie, and then, Walter, I learned I wasn't going to be a businessman. I rode my bicycle around Montserrat for a couple of years. But he led me around and showed me how to do it.
Mm-hmm. Now, your father was, are you a junior? Are you Fred Hammond Jr.?
Not quite, because my middle name is different than my father.
Uh-huh. Mm-hmm.
My father's Frederick Wallace, and I'm Frederick Carr. My father worked at the Shoe, coming out of World War I, over in Salem. And the family moved over somewhere in the mid-1920s. And again, the family moved to Montserrat pretty much. And my father met my mother, apparently walking to work or walking to school. She lived down near Dane Street Beach, and she was a new teacher at Beverly High School teaching history. Mm-hmm. And they married in 1933 in my grandfather's farm up in Scarborough, Maine. It's very fortunate, Walter, to have caring parents. And my mother was a college graduate at BU, one of the earliest founding members of the Beverly College Club. My father was actively involved in the men's singing club, loved to sing. My father played the saxophone coming out of World War I and played in the United Shoe concert band, and later, of course, was active in the singing club. Mm-hmm. So I followed. My mother was a big sports fan. My grandfather looked a little bit like Teddy Roosevelt. And of course, he admired Teddy Roosevelt as a young man living in Boston. And he was a Red Sox fan. My mother drove him around Boston to see games and stuff. And
well, it's easy to see, Fred, how your father's interest in music and your mother's interest in sports kind of was passed down to you, because those are two of your passions.
Absolutely.
Now, if you were to say what biggest takeaways from your life as a kid? Now, you were born in 1935, which was not right in the heart of the Depression, was
Yes,
it?
it was.
because it was. So tell us, how was that growing up as a kid, and what kind of things did your parents instill in you, aside from the love of sports and music?
I think they were careful financially. My father never had a new car, always. But the other thing about him, and I think this was part of the Depression too, was he took enormous care of what he owned, because there weren't a lot of things around, I guess. My father never lost his job in in the Great Depression. The shoe never closed down. They went to 4 days a week. But I think probably they delayed marriage because they were fearful of the job situation. But there really was no unemployment or anything like that.
Mm-hmm. And I know that you have some, you have
this
some
is
images.
A picture of my mother and father. Probably my favorite picture, Walter.
Mm-hmm.
They're dancing at the Unitarian Parish Hall, which was torn down in the 50s to make a parking lot for the National Bank.
Mm-hmm. And what year was this photo
It'd be in the
taken?
1940s.
Mm-hmm.
This would be some sort of a social, and they're dancing, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
This is a picture, which is in my book, Reflections,
Mm-hmm.
of my family in, again, late 40s. Myself on the far side, my mother, Irene Carr Hammond, my father, Fred W. Hammond, and my brother, Herbert Hammond. This is I think a very typically middle-class photo. Dutch colonial house in the middle of Bertram Street. It looks exactly today as it did then. It went through some tough times, Walter, and really looked, threadbare and worn apart. But the Murphys live there today, and they brought it back nicely.
Mm-hmm. But you were two children. The two boys were the only two boys,
that's
and your brother was younger than you were.
5 years younger.
5 years younger.
Yeah.
And tell us a little bit about, or if you have another picture you want to show, about some of your early school days. And
well, this is the orchestra I had in high school with my good friend Arthur Bauer. Arthur played electric guitar. Of course, I played tenor saxophone. We had 7 pieces in the band. In 1952, we formed, and we played the Glenn Miller big band music. You can see how we're dressed here with a...
Very appropriate.
Ironically, the clothes, the jackets we bought here, which were light blue, we purchased from Alvin Mitchell, who at that time, Alvin had a little clothing business in downtown Beverly. Arthur Day, who later became a policeman down in Manchester, Beverly Farms fellow, played trumpet. Richard Chick played alto saxophone along with Leslie Sigmund. And Ernest Flint played trombone. Bruce Sharp played piano. And it was a wonderful group of fellows.
And how many were in the band?
Seven originally.
7 pieces, yeah.
I think the biggest we ever had was about 11.
Mm-hmm. And did you, what kind of, did you play for weddings? Did you have gigs in clubs?
Basically school dances,
Mm-hmm.
including some colleges as well as high schools, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Traveled a little bit.
Mm-hmm. And how long did the band stay together?
Let's see, it stayed together those 2 years, 52, 53, and then I went off to college up at Colby in Waterville, Maine, and my brother took it over.
Mm-hmm.
So I would come back and play with him. So we were the Dreamlanders here. We became the Hammond Brothers, I guess. And that was nice, too, because we played the same music, of course, with different musicians. Mm-hmm. So we went till about 1959, 1960, I guess.
Mm-hmm. And now you were a wind and a brass player?
No, I was a tenor sax, I still am today.
Mm-hmm.
This is a picture of my good brother who passed away in 2009 of cancer. My brother Herb, who was extremely well liked and known in the city of Beverly. In this picture here, he says a high school graduation picture. He was president of the student government, and later on, of course, he became a college hockey coach and a professional scout, graduate of Springfield College.
Very good-looking young man there.
Yeah, he was quite a special guy.
And what kind of a career did he have?
Basically education, athletic coaching primarily, yeah. He ended up at Brown University in the 80s. And of course, as a professional scout, Walter, his name appears on the Stanley Cup because the Rangers won the Cup in '94, and he's there with the other Ranger players and stuff.
Talk about a little-known fact. That's
probably the only Beverly man on the Stanley Cup. Yeah.
Now tell us a little bit about your high school days and your involvement in sports. I know that you're.
I was on the track team. I was captain my senior year, but Doc Rudkin was the coach. It was a good experience.
And what were your events?
I was primarily a 220 and relay.
And what kind of times did you have in the 220?
Oh, not that great, Walter. I was just an ordinary runner, I guess. But I ran with some good people. I think growing up in Beverly, the YMCA, the Dane Street Church, were very, very influential. The Boy Scouts, very, very influential. I think one of the reasons I got into Colby was because of leadership shown in the track team, the band, and student government, things like that. The YMCA was good because at 15 I got a job at the YMCA day camp, and I worked there on and off for the next 20-odd years, I guess, in the summertime. And of course, when I started to work at the day camp, and at the age 15 with Red Wallace and Russ Rollins and Ron Ducharme and a few others, it more or less meant that I would become a school teacher because I liked working with kids. And
now, just turning back to your Colby college days, what kind of courses? Tell us a little bit about what you did at Colby.
Colby was one of the things I wanted to mention, of course, was that Frank Root was my guidance counselor. And Mr. Root lived up on Baker Avenue, so he was sort of a neighbor, although we didn't really know him very well. But when I came along as a junior, senior at Beverly High School, he urged me to apply to Bates, Colby, Springfield, Bowdoin and Wesleyan, I think. And because of him, I went to Colby, basically, and on his advice. My good wife came along a year behind me. She's in the class of '54. And Mr. Root looked at her, and she wasn't going to go to college. The family didn't have any money. And he said, no, you've got pretty good mechanical aptitude. Why don't you go over to Beverly Hospital and interview for X-ray technician? So she went over there and learned at Beverly Hospital and worked there for 7 or 8 or 9 years. And that was very good for her, too. I met my wife, Gay, through the Dane Street Church Fellowship.
And you got a picture there.
And this is a picture of Gay and my 3 children, taken in 1982. Christopher and Brad are the 2 boys, and Jennifer's the daughter. They are all doing well today. Brad has a business up in Putney, Vermont, running a takeout. And Christopher is in financial. He lives in Boxford. And Jennifer is a very good carpenter down in Charleston, South Carolina.
She is a carpenter.
Yeah. And Gay, of course, in the picture here, is a wonderful gardener. Yeah. Lady with the green thumb.
And did she make a career at the hospital on the advice of? Did she
Yes.
get into X-ray technique?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And loved it.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is a picture of Gay and I and the 2 older children, Jennifer and Christopher, just taken a year or so ago.
Now, right after
The last picture I'm going to show, then we'll go back, okay?
Sure, yeah.
This was just taken last week. And you and Kim will realize that this is the Beverly Senior Center, the band that you fellows saw and we actually taped for Bev Camp. And the fellows in the front row, 4 of the 5 are Beverly fellows, is Bob Gove over here, myself playing tenor sax, Bob's in baritone, Roger Warnson who is about 90 years of age as we sit here today. Mario Carrabba, the leader of the band, who's from Lynn. And Ken Savory, the other tenor sax player on the far side. We've been together, the sax section has been together about 8 years, I think. And of course, 3 of us play in the Dane Street concert band. So getting back into music in the 1980s was one of the best things I've done.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now let's go back and fill in right after college. Now you graduated in 57?
57.
57.
Yeah.
So tell us what did life offer you then? What did you do right after graduating
I went
from college?
to BU and got a master's degree in history because I wanted to get more knowledge in the field. And then I started teaching at Beverly High School that fall, mm-hmm. which is 59.
And how long did you teach at Beverly High School?
38 years, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Back then, Walter, you went to school, you came out, you got a job, and you tended to stay in that job, mm-hmm. you know. And I had no reason to leave it. I could have gone into administration, but I didn't really want to do it. So I started with the kids and ended with the kids. Taught about 4,000 kids and mm-hmm. coached another 1,000 in track and field.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And now, and your wife, did she work the whole time, or when you started having kids, did she become a stay-at-home mom?
Yeah, she became a stay-at-home mom, and then went back to work when my youngest, Brad, was 14, I think. Mm-hmm. And she worked with Leonard Gothia mm-hmm. for 12 years, yeah, mm-hmm. yeah.
And you did coaching at the high school as well?
I coached track from 64 to 1980, yeah.
Any memorable moments during that?
Well, we have a Hall of Fame coming up this April, and my relay team, the New England Championship relay team, is going to go in the Hall of Fame. And we've been on the phone, and Bob Bruto is one of the 4, Landmark School.
Yeah, we know Bob, sure.
And we're going to have a little gathering down at Landmark and try to get together a whole crew of people that these fellows ran with. Lloyd Hartwell, Paul Taché, both live in Arizona, they're coming. Tom Wittenhagen and Bob Bruto.
Mm-hmm. Now during your time from after college till now, have you done much traveling outside of Beverly?
Yeah, we've traveled all over the United States.
You have? Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Any international travel?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
7 times to Europe, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So now,
right now we enjoy our place in Hamilton.
I'll bet. And I've been to your place in Hamilton. I've even gotten some of your tomatoes in the fall with that big rich harvest that you get. Now, how you are considered by many to be Mr. History. If anybody ever asks, well, who knows about the history of Beverly? Everybody points to Fred Hammond. And how was it? Because what kept your interest in the history of Beverly all these years?
That's good. When I was a high school senior, you had to write a term paper. I think it was for an English class, actually. And my mother said, well, you go down to the Historical Society and write it on Roger Conant. So that started me with local history, mm-hmm. although she was always interested in local history. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, when I taught American history, Walter, I always included Salem and Beverly mm-hmm. and tried to make local references. And, of course, I joined the society in the 70s, I think, and been active down here since then. But I always thought that local history was an aspect of the bigger national history, you know. You study the Industrial Revolution, but you can talk about the United Shoe here, you know, and you talk about like the exhibit we just have here, and we just did a program on maritime trade. You know, it's a big thing. And the immigration to the city, I grew up with first generation American kids. A lot of their parents came from Italy, among other places, and that was a good experience. So I've always been interested in history. I still read history, Walter, and I teach it over at the Explorers Institute at Salem State. I'm going to do a course in April on settlement of the Salem area. Yeah.
Very interesting. Now, is your interest in history, like, do you also study ancient history, the Greeks, the Romans as well?
I'm pretty much like American history. That's my field. I did study a lot of European history at Colby. So I have a background in Europe. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of ancient or Asian or non-European background. Back then, just wasn't offered that much, you know. But I like history. I always have liked it.
Now tell us about your relationship with the Beverly Historical Society. How did that get started? And tell us about your involvement with the Historical Society.
I always wanted to be involved, and Bob Lovett was down here, wonderful man. He was a Harvard University grad, and he worked at Harvard University in the library. And he had a nice old house up in North Beverly, near the North Beverly Church. And I became quite close to him. Harold Pinkham, down here living on Thorndike Street. Harold taught history at Salem State. And I met him because we have practice teachers from Salem State. And so Harold became a good influence on me. And I've just been involved for a long time. What do you think about it?
You know what I think that you're very well known for, and I know that BevCam has produced and run some programs, and your tours around Beverly. You do tours that accentuate the Civil War and Beverly's involvement in the Civil War and maritime involvement. How did that come about?
That's a good question, because I'm kind of proud of this. There weren't any historic tours till I started them. And I started them just the year after I retired, which I think is 97. So I've done well over 30 tours, homecoming primarily. And I just will be doing some reading down here, and I'll look for a part of the city I'd like to know more about and walk people that part of the city. So I've even done Centerville, Walter.
That's where I live.
And one year I did Ralph Side, and it was about a 5-mile walk.
But
I don't do 5 miles anymore.
Well, now let me ask you. You've probably had a lot of different people that have come on those walking tours. What would have been some of the most interesting questions, or people? What surprised you about what people ask you when you go on those when you give those tours?
Well, I think they're generally interested in their house and in the section of the city and in Beverly in general. It's nice when I have a half a dozen former students on the tour, which happened 2 years ago when I did Montserrat. But a lot of them I'll never see again, but there's a natural interest in the city. The city's a good place, Walter. It really is. You came here from California.
Well, yes, the last jump was from California.
Yeah, it's a good place. Beverly has a lot of interesting history, a nice geography, nice people.
Yeah, certainly the East Coast and where the original Pilgrims and the original settlers came in. This certainly has a much more richer history than, let's say, the far western coast. Okay, well, Fred, thank you for joining us on this episode of Reflections.
Thank you, Walter.
I have been interviewing
It's
Fred
a pleasure.
Hammond on this. How did I do, Fred, as an interviewer?
Pretty well. Pretty well.
Yeah. So if you ever need somebody to sit in for you on a reflection show, you know where to go, right, Fred?
Right.
Okay. Well, for Fred Hammond and for me, Walt Kosmowski, this has been another reflection show. And join Fred Hammond next time on the next show, Reflections, provided by the Beverly Historical Society and BevCam.